The paper is quite abstract, so I always thought it's helpful if people have something concrete to look at. And of course, the relationship between the particular and the universal, or the concrete and the abstract, is kind of what's central here. So this paper is called Provincializing MacDiarmid, and it will make some suggestions about the potential of recent calls for decolonization of teaching and research as they might be applied in modern Scottish literary history. And taking as a central case study the most influential Scottish poet of the 20th century, Hugh MacDiarmid, I will ask what it might mean to provincialize MacDiarmid in the sense posed by Dipesh Chakrabarti in his well-known book, Provincializing Europe, while recognizing what I see as a provincializing effect, which is already central to MacDiarmid's own cultural criticism. After all, who can claim to have so excoriatingly provincialized the Scotland of his day more unequivocally, unendingly, and it seems unreasonable not to add hyperbolically, than MacDiarmid? So I'll begin by saying something about current work in decolonization before mapping out what I take to be the influence of post-colonial studies on the evaluation of MacDiarmid since the 1990s. The remainder of the paper will be suggestions for 3 ways in which this might work on thinking through questions around decolonization might lead to a reevaluation of MacDiarmid. So just to begin, contemporary calls for decolonization within the universities of the global north identify a political, educational, and epistemological task of critique. Reframing decolonization as an unfinished project, they draw attention to the legacies of imperialism, not only within post-colonial states, but within the former imperial metropoles. They emphasize economic and social impacts as well as cultural ones, and they challenge the Eurocentric premises of the concepts and categories available to theorize political anti-colonialism. And notably for our purposes, that includes a long-running debate on the validity and efficacy of the nation state as a political form. So although in a number of ways, decolonial thought clearly extends and deepens themes prominent in earlier post-colonial theory, I want to emphasize today the challenge that it poses to the widespread adoption of what I will call weak post-colonial theory in British cultural and literary studies. And this is well illustrated in the case of Scotland. So post-colonial frameworks, as probably all of us know, and many of you will have contributed to this work, came to be absorbed into Scottish literary studies in the course of the 1990s, whereas a marginal strand of earlier work following Michael Hector's controversial internal colonialism thesis in the 1970s had seen colonialism or imperialism as primarily economic in focus. The turn to the post-colonial and literary studies is predominantly culturalist, so it sidesteps materialist analysis, and it assumes the premise that Scottish cultural development can be understood as having been distorted through the colonial influence of English norms, as much as or more than through its involvement in the imperial project itself. And whatever its overt concerns, this allows for cultural production in Scotland to be read as a site of a generative struggle between different linguistic registers, cultural forms, and social and intellectual traditions. And in this process, Scottish literary critics found themselves coming into alignment with key motifs of MacDiarmid's own arguments against the ascendancy, as he puts it, of English styles and modes over Scottish traditions. Albeit recent critics also believed that they were witness to a contemporary literary revival, which was itself premised on the rejection of the mid-century Scottish modernism identified with MacDiarmid. Like MacDiarmid, these critical trends tend to evade the question of why earlier styles and tastes should now be considered passé. Unlike MacDiarmid, by collapsing the modernist distinction between art and culture, or kitsch, they ran the risk of celebrating the middlebrow and the formulaic. So this reading of MacDiarmid's cultural analysis in terms of the struggle for cultural recognition and interpreting his poetics as a vindication of the vernacular and the eccentric brings his work into alignment with writers of otherwise quite different political viewpoints. And that's kind of signaled in my quotation from Tom Leonard on the slide. And I think the continuity of the vocabulary of anti-imperialism on the global left obscures some of the kind of profound differences between MacDiarmid's communism and the views of later libertarian socialists like Leonard and Kelman, who actually have a much kind of stronger articulation of their own work with dissident writers in post-colonial contexts. So what emerged from this revaluation was what I take now to be a standard reading of MacDiarmid's political and aesthetic agenda as broadly being that of a decolonial nationalist writer rather than either a reactionary modernist or as a committed communist. Those were really the two positions which were being debated when I was a student of MacDiarmid. This reading seemed to resolve some of the contradictions in MacDiarmid's politics, so it was powerful in that sense, and it allows for sympathetic engagement with the fault lines and pressures in MacDiarmid's poetics as reflecting broader concerns within post-colonial modernisms. And as Fiona has just been saying, the categories of hybridity, a poetics of collage or montage, interest in the struggle around the idea of authenticity, and the poet as being representative of a people, all link MacDiarmid in some ways to other strands of post-colonial writing. Now, there are some obvious ambiguities within this picture, which is why it tends to be advanced kind of provisionally and more through analogy than through extended comparison. And as a more detached observer, Stephen Howe, the prominent historian of empire, has noted, MacDiarmid has been the most central figure to this construction of a post-colonial Scottish literary history. So this is going to be a long quotation from Stephen Howe. Scholars and critics have not only tracked down the scattered allusions to colonial politics and literatures in his work, and emphasized how his extraordinarily wide-ranging intellectual curiosity and political engagement embraced many colonial themes. Some have also urged that the quote, and our panel chair may recognize this quotation from his own book, the political evolution of MacDiarmid's poetry marks the shift from elitist modernism, indicative of the waning of British imperial control, to the ideal of a post-colonial society. Howe goes on, it must surely be added, though, that such colonial and anti-colonial themes feature in only a very small portfolio of the poet's writings, while although his interests may have been global, his activities were rather less so. Indeed, it is striking, he concludes, how far the literary political circles in which MacDiarmid moved included rather few non-Scots, still fewer non-Europeans, and almost literally no non-whites. So decolonial reading of MacDiarmid, we might say, could go beyond the post-colonial, but we might have to recognize, in line with Howe's response, that it might be a history of evasions and silence and of encounters missed or refused. And I want to acknowledge here as well that there's a legitimate question which arises as to the extent to which any approach to literary history which continues to recenter a figure who has been so dominant in the field could itself be described as decolonial. So what would it take to trouble this kind of what I take as the established post-colonial reading of MacDiarmid? And I'm going to draw out three strands of inspiration from decolonial scholarship. So the first lesson to draw is that decolonization has tended to be viewed as an inexorable stage of historical development, which beginning in Europe spreads across the globe after the Second World War. But most contemporary work now strongly emphasizes the difference between what we might see as two waves of decolonization. So separating out the emergence of small European states from the late 19th century onwards and accelerating after World War I from the wave of decolonization in the rest of the world after the Second World War. And far from being the benign management of a kind of an inevitable dismantling of empire, this process, these activists and scholars emphasize, depended on the intellectual, cultural, and political struggle of colonized peoples and was met with violent resistance and contestation by European powers. So given MacDiarmid's emphasis on the historical context and engagement of his work, this might then give us a strong ground to re-establish a dividing line between that of his work of the 1920s and 1930s and his writing of the post-war period, on the grounds that the political international context for his work has drastically shifted. And this would make in memoriam James Joyce a fascinating test case because, as Alex has already mentioned, Jim has shown this in great detail, it's largely compiled of fragments written in the 1930s, whether by MacDiarmid or others, but assembled in a radically changed international political context, and whose vision of the world, in the idea of world language, draws very unevenly on potentially ethnocentric traditions of 19th century European philology, as well as committed interwar anti-colonial writers and activists like Leonard Woolf, although that may be a rather singular passage in the poem. So in the extraordinarily productive years of the 1920s and 30s, MacDiarmid is focused on establishing Scottish literature as a voice within the chorus of world literature, which, as in the quotation that Fiona used, he almost always uses in German, suggesting that the terms within which he sees this category do run directly back to Goethe, and that this sees both major and minor nations as having distinctive literary and cultural heritages. But in line with other kind of critical rereadings of this category, the argument might be here that it tends to repeat the assumptions of the 18th century that the nation is a characteristic feature of European peoples only, and that therefore the category of world literature is an unreliable one because it's been involved in, if you like, a hierarchical stratification of the world literary space. So despite his repeated reference in this period to the decadence of Western civilization and the need for its renewal, my suggestion would be that MacDiarmid's historical understanding and his construction of kind of global culture in this period remains profoundly Eurocentric, so in need of some kind of provincialization. And what that might look like would be that displacing the terms of his own framework into a broader global history of decolonization would effectively subject it to critique, meaning here just taking a kind of a more distanced evaluative stance, which might allow for a kind of recontextualization of what's distinctive about his modernism of inner vision, the themes of a kind of poetics of silence, which come through at a lot of the critical points in his poetry, but that must be pursued through a crisis of authenticity and authority. So I think we could kind of establish new comparative frameworks, I guess, for understanding MacDiarmid once we step back a bit from the frameworks that he is proffering within which he wants his work to be received. A second line of inquiry, and again thinking in terms of this renewed demarcation between the two phases of his work, might be a careful reassessment of his anti-imperial political rhetoric. And I think recent work has tended to assume that this is that what he means here is the same through time, and that what he means is in line with post-colonial critique. But rather than looking for an underlying decolonial nationalism, I wonder if what this might explore would be the tensions which arise from the idiosyncratic equation he makes of the idea of English ascendancy, drawn from the vocabulary of Irish republicanism, with the long-standing Scottish tradition of response to Anglicisation as a marker for processes of social modernisation in general. So MacDiarmid's own stated interest here is in the spiritual failure which allows for that process in the first place, i.e. a rot that sets in well before the Reformation, hence the nature of his kind of counter-reactionary modernism, which develops later into his adoption of a visionary communist ideal with only cursory reference to this historical process of Soviet imperialism, that being the other kind of strong reason to resist an easy decolonial reading of MacDiarmid. Now, this reading might also emphasize the degree to which empire functions as the assumed horizon for almost all British politics on the left and the right in the interwar years, with very few exceptions, explaining its strong presence as a theme within MacDiarmid's writing for the National Party of Scotland. And here, although historians such as Richard Findlay have cited MacDiarmid as evidence of what they see as a kind of extreme anti-imperialist wing within the early nationalist movement, I take the stronger strand in his work here to be that independence should be pursued within the framework of a decentralized imperial federation, a kind of form of utopianism in which the center is reconfigured through restoration of balance with the peripheries, which somewhat prefigures the devolution of English literature, or the archipelagic readings even called for by Robert Crawford and others in the 1990s. So to some extent, MacDiarmid is already ahead of the criticism that sought to receive him. And then finally, I wonder about the degree to which attention to MacDiarmid's kind of changing vocabulary of anti-imperialism can simply be understood as a straightforward adoption of communist rhetoric, so that anti-imperialism here really simply means anti-capitalism, which is understood as leading inexorably to militarism and war. And again, that explains that the idea of a post-colonial MacDiarmid or an anti-imperialist MacDiarmid is covering over some real political tensions which he doesn't perhaps want to engage with in his work. And finally, and to wrap up, a third line of inquiry might engage with the shift from the more romantic account of world literature to this vision of world language in the late work, and it's great to see that there's so much kind of interest, I think, in memoriam James Joyce at the moment, as Fiona's work and Jim's work kind of suggest. And the question to be posed here, I think, goes beyond whether or not MacDiarmid makes a successful break with Eurocentrism and the degree to which the poem perhaps embeds ideas around shared Indo-European heritage when he's thinking about the Celtic in particular, which undermines his attempt to think globally. So the struggle to rethink world literature as world language and to challenge not primarily linguistic imperialism, but capitalist processes of standardization has to be understood as internal to the poem itself. So in epistemological terms, this is the stake of the work, to distinguish the world from the universal. And then in political terms, authorized and to some extent corrupted, I think, by his alignment with Soviet communism, to distinguish between what he calls kinless cosmopolitanism, anything which is the product of imperialist capitalism, and true internationalism. And at this point, we come back to the tension between nationalism and internationalism, or the relationship between them, which kind of runs through his work of this period. So the task of a decolonial critique would be to kind of explore and challenge both the political and the epistemological frames that the poem proposes, through questioning of the terms that mediate his understanding of language, and to ask whether the distinctions he proposes can hold. And just to allude very briefly to the final line of work that's going on here, the long-running debate about the validity of the nation-state form and the effectiveness and efficacy of anti-colonial nationalism and its implications might, I think, be really helpful here, because the stress in a lot of recent rethinking of this work is the degree to which, if you like, a critique of the nation has to go through the nation, and that an international or global thinking either should or shouldn't have to reckon with the national. And that, I think, is the sort of the key outstanding debate in the reception of MacDiarmid's thought in general. So there's perhaps a lot to be done there as a sort of starting point for thinking more broadly about what we do with Scottish literary history.